Okay, so we are recording this, and it will be archived for people to watch. You're welcome to ask questions during the presentation, but be aware that if you ask questions during the presentation, they will be recorded for posterity. So if you would prefer, at the end, we'll also stop the recording and have a discussion session that we won't record. So if you have questions that are very specific to you, or that that you aren't comfortable having people here later, you could ask them then. So I at Penn, actually, as part of the focus on leadership for women's group, developed a writing course, which actually ended up being more of a kind of a publications process management course for junior faculty. And one of the things that we found as we taught that course at Penn for 5 years was that there were things about the publication process where it seemed that mentors didn't have information that their mentees needed, or where mentees were having issues with their mentors during the publication process due to lack of communication. And so we, in that course that we taught for the junior faculty, tried to rectify it on that side and developed this talk to speak to the mentors about how they can best help their mentees, their junior faculty, typically mentees, develop a successful publication strategy. Be aware that a lot of these pieces of advice were developed in mind of a setting like Penn, a traditional academic setting with a fairly high bar for number of publications. So not all of it will exactly apply in some of our more clinical settings, but I think the general gist is still true. So the first thing that's true is that your mentees need a plan, and that one of the things that's important is that their plan not be your plan. It can certainly be a piece of your plan and aligned with your plan, and it's often a good idea for it to be aligned with your plan, because then it's easier and more efficient for you to mentor them, and work that you spend mentoring them also coincides with work that interests you, and so it's likely to go better. But obviously, the area that could be based on the clinical interests, what really are the research goals, and what are the educational plans. I have been working, I'm continuing to work with a young physician at ChristianaCare who was originally told by her, people that she looked to for guidance that she didn't really need specific research, education, or training, that she could just start doing the work and it would be fine. And in the case of the career that she's interested in building, her research goals, that's actually not true. And so, so especially for clinicians who may not have had any formal research training, in the modern era especially, you may want to think about whether formal research training at whatever level, it's not that they have to go out and get a PhD, but, might they want a master's degree, or might they want a certificate, or might they just want to select some guided short courses and things at good professional meetings that would help them meet their research goals and give them the experience they need to do that. And I think that, for the mentor, helping to define that set of skills that they need and which skills they can learn by doing and which skills they really should get some specific education on is an important role of the mentor. Obviously, what does the field look like now? And that's, I think, something that the mentors can help with a lot. What has been done and where are there opportunities for future research? My first PhD mentor, and yes, I did start 3 PhD programs before I finished one. My first PhD mentor, which was in evolutionary biology, gave me the premier journal in the field, gave me several years of back issues, and said, here, read these, and when we meet every week, have read one issue and identify 3 research questions as you're reading the articles that are in there. And when I would define those research questions, he would go over them with me and he would say, well, that's actually a great idea, but somebody already did it. You know, you can go look it up in this place, or he would give me the name and have me go look it up. Or he would say, well, that seems like it might be a good idea, but you know, I know some people who tried to do that and it turns out that it's not actually feasible. And then maybe the third idea, he would say, yeah, that's actually researchable. Go ahead and put it on your ideas list. And, you know, since then I've kept an ideas list of what the field looks like now and where there are opportunities. The other thing that's especially important for clinical faculty is how their plan fits into the department plan. Because unlike more traditional academic settings, it's often the case that to get time, protected time to do research, it's important that that research contribute to an overall departmental or system plan, and helping your mentees understand what are the research priorities for the department or for the health system, and so on, especially if they're not going to be doing major grant-funded research, but are going to be fitting their research in alongside with their clinical work. This is particularly important. And then for everyone, regardless of how they're going to fund their research or what plan they're on, how does the plan fit into the current state of the world? Is it a new topic? Is it something cutting edge? Is it something that you can reinvent to make it cutting edge? There's pretty much, I think, all health services researchers, because it's not that old a field, have the standing joke that we change the name of what we do every 3 to 5 years as funding priorities change. And so in my career, I've called my work guidelines implementation. I've called it evidence-based medicine. I've called it shared decision-making. I've called it, you know, disparities. And it's all really the same work, but understanding how it fits into the current state of the world has helped get funding and get opportunities for publishing the work. After they have an overall research plan, they need to have a plan, a writing plan, and obviously all of you are very experienced with actually writing a manuscript, but you know, these are the steps that I talk about with my mentees. What was their goal? Why is it important? What did they do? What did they find? What is most important? What criticisms should be anticipated, and what are the next steps? And I ask them to answer those questions before they actually think about writing the manuscript. Somehow asking the questions separate from the act of writing the manuscript gets the manuscript half written, whereas as soon as they feel that they're actually writing the manuscript, there's some tendency towards freezing. To help obviate that before writing, I personally, not everyone does this, I personally recommend that authors decide what journal they're going to publish in. I have a couple of tools that I like to use. Biosemantics. Biosemantics.org is one of my very favorite things. It is a website that's funded by the government of the Netherlands, and you can put a title of a paper in to it, and so you can say, let's say that you were doing work on, I'll just use a made-up title of this work that Marcy is working on now, public perceptions of Ebola risk and attitudes toward Ebola and influenza vaccines. Something like that. That might not be what she ends up calling it, but doesn't really matter. But you put your title in there, and then you can press find journals, and it does a semantic search that's like how Pandora finds music, and it kind of tells you where maybe have these things been published, vaccine, the American Journal of Infection Control. And if you're interested in knowing more, whoops, sorry, apparently we're having issues.
Can everyone see it now, the website?
No?
They should have. It should be okay.
Okay. We'll see if this is working. Yeah. The American Journal of Infection Control, for example, you can look at the articles that are there and public health workers and beliefs concerning influenza vaccines. So this seems to have more worker-related things. It might not be ideal, but you can look through these and see which ones look like a good match for what you're doing. So I like that tool a lot. And then there's another tool called PubsHub that actually gives you information about specific journals. It is a subscription service. Christianacare has it. I don't know if the other systems have it, but you can go online and find out what the impact factor is, what the average time from submission to acceptance and acceptance to publication is, what the rejection rate is, and so on, information about that. I also have all of my mentees build a timeline for their papers, understanding that timelines do slip to some degree, but to try to build a realistic timeline of what they're going to do when they're hoping to have the draft submitted. And then the other thing that I feel is very important to do before any writing starts is the negotiation of the co-authorship and who's going to be what position author. I think that the mentor can play an important role in negotiating this. The mentor can help their mentee deal with more senior people who may want a role that's inappropriate for their actual role in writing the paper. But the mentor can also make it very clear to the mentee what level of work is required to be the first or second author of a paper. And the other piece is, as a mentor, at some point you want to make a decision about when to step back, and on any individual paper that your mentee is writing, to have the discussion with your mentee separately from the other co-authors about whether this is a paper that you will or will not be an author on, for your mentee to establish their independence, which is something that NIH is increasingly looking for. They need to start establishing a track record that does not include their primary mentors on every piece of work that they do. And so you want to think about when it's time, or which papers you want to be involved with because they are very close to your own lines of inquiry, and which papers are tangential enough that it's more appropriate that you are not involved as an author. The other thing for the clinicians that we found is that making time to write is as much of an issue as anything else. And, it sounds a little bit funny, but a lot of this is about not just making the time, but understanding your own work patterns and your biorhythms and setting aside time to write. We had our clinicians set aside a 20 to 30-minute session 3 times a week, and they were amazed that by doing this, they could actually get a good first draft manuscript out in 4 to 6 weeks, typically. Maybe for the first time, it would be more like, 6 to 8 weeks. Don't get into the binge. That's supposed to be writing, not riding, but obviously we know where my mind goes. But don't get into the binge writing thought process. Don't think, oh, I'll write this when I have a half day off. And then, of course, the half day comes and goes and you haven't written it. Oh, well, now I need a full day, and that's 3 weeks away. I'll write the whole thing then. And then that doesn't happen. And then you're like, oh, now I somehow need to figure out when I have a whole weekend that I can devote. And you really don't want to get into that. You want to set aside steady time to write pieces. And you, as a mentor, want to help your mentees be able to do this. So one of the things we talk about is protecting your time from time sharks. and asking for help protecting it. And that's, where we as mentors can step in and help our mentees know that it's okay to shut their door, know that it's okay to be off-site as long as they're reachable during writing times or whatever, helping reinforce the message that writing time is important and that, they shouldn't be interrupted during writing time. And then helping them understand what helps them be productive and what's a distraction. Sometimes thinking outside the box is helpful. If you, as a mentor, have writing tips that work for you that you think your mentee might not know about. So I've found that because a lot of clinicians are very familiar with dictation, that use of something like Dragon Speech or other dictation systems is actually very helpful to them in the writing process, and many of them had never thought of applying those tools to the research writing process. So things like that, if you have other tips helping your mentee know that it doesn't all have to be just sitting in an office typing on a computer, whatever. This is the usual, what has been done. Of course, you'll ask your mentee to do a comprehensive literature review, but you, as a mentor, can help in identifying some of the politics of what's going on, as well as the important names in the field, what things they may want to look for, even aside from just a traditional literature review, if there's other related work. One of the things that I find is that many clinicians only look specifically for the methodology they're interested in the area in the clinical area they're interested in. And as a mentor, I might say to them, well, it is a new thing in your area, which is great, but here you might want to read these papers that have been written about a similar methodology in a different clinical setting and things like that. The other thing that you can, as a mentor, really help with is help your mentees understand what the weaknesses in the prior work were. If they're fairly new to research or new to the research environment, they may not be used to the concept of critiquing prior articles. And so the question is are they looking at a different population pool, a broader population, a different disease severity, a different clinical area? Is their methodology better, stronger, whatever? Were there prior criticisms or issues of this work, whether that was published or it's things that you've heard or know about through your position in the clinical community? And if there are conflicting findings, helping your mentees know about that and to address that as they move their work forward. Most introductions are too long. Most introductions written by folks new to the writing process are way too long. And I think that this is a place where mentors can be very helpful in shortening and tightening up drafts. And the really clear statement of the research question and problem is an area that I find often needs more attention than it gets, and that's something that's very helpful for the mentor to go back and help with, because by the time the mentee's writing this, by the time they get to this, they're so engrossed in the project and they're so clear on what the goal is of the project that they often don't write it down clearly. And so helping them be able to do that is a good idea. There's kind of an ongoing debate about whether discussions should be structured. I do refer newer writers to this article in the editorial, I guess, in the BMJ about a structured discussion, because it helps some of them understand how to put together the discussion, even if they don't stick to the strict structuring in the final version. And then obviously helping them with the conclusions of what is the real take-home message, again, helping them not get too lost in the trees and keeping that big overarching view, what should be changed because of the work, this idea of really what is the specific what are the specific next steps or subpopulations or other clinical areas or whatever, or what should be changed in the policy world or the clinical world or the management world or whatever, as opposed to the really generic additional research is needed or the implications are unclear, which are perennial favorites with novice writers. I honestly believe that writing is the easy part. I recognize that for many people it's not that easy. So, I don't mean to undermine that, but I think that the other piece is the time management, as we talked about, blocking off time for your writing and having your timelines, project management, understanding how the projects overlap, and, one of the biggest problems I think we all have, and I don't think this is just our mentees, I think many of us have this problem as well, is that starting new projects gets in the way of us finishing other projects. I often actually negotiate with my co-authors that I will do the bulk of the heavy lifting on the initial submission, editing, and so on and so forth, if they will help me wrangle the revise and resubmit, because by the time the revise and resubmit comes back, I'm usually really tired of the project and have moved on in my mind to something else, and often need a push to deal with that. And so that's something I know about myself. But this is really important that projects get finished, that they get published. I'm a big believer in project tracking, in knowing where things are and understanding how many papers you have out under submission so that you might have a sense of when they're going to come back and get in the way of writing and your writing timeline for your new projects. I also think it's really important as a mentor to celebrate your mentees' successes and help them be sure they can tell a story about what their research is about. And this is especially true in the clinical area, where they might be doing some collaborative research and some of their own research, and they may have some different clinical areas, but just really being able to twine that together and to have that elevator or escalator speech about what their research is about. I also think that while it's not at all inappropriate to aim high, that sometimes it is frustrating for mentees to submit every paper to the best possible journal, be that JAMA New England Journal or be that Circulation or whatever, and then have them mostly get rejected. I think that there's something to be said for having this sense of matching the paper and matching sort of the intensity of the research work and the importance of the research to the journal. On the other hand, I've seen a little bit the opposite problem at ChristianaCare, where junior investigators are being counseled to submit their work to non-peer-reviewed publications, which I believe should pretty much never happen. So do you want to help with that as well? I also think that as we think about the CTR and we think about things like the community engagement pieces and more pragmatic research and other kinds of non-traditional research, that there are also non-traditional papers. I do start many of my mentees, and especially maybe less so junior faculty members, but especially student and staff researchers, start with papers that don't require clinically based or laboratory based data collection, but rather are based on literature data collection. And so these might not be meta-analyses per se, although they might be, although meta-analyses are harder than most people think they are. And so suggesting that someone do a meta-analysis is not always a kindness, but review papers, that don't have to be fully systematic review papers in an area, if they're doing that review work anyway to write a grant, to think about whether there's a paper appropriate, and thinking about how many papers a project should be, which is what are the legitimate pieces that should be done, to what degree should they be put together versus separated out, without getting into the inappropriate, salami slicing approach to the work. But still, I'm finding, for example, that when people are not doing clinical trials, so there's trial design descriptions which are typically published, but when people aren't doing a clinical trial, they don't recognize that they can publish a program development and implementation paper before there are results necessarily about why the program was needed and how it was designed and how it was implemented and what the barriers and facilitators to that implementation were. Much as you would do a trial design description, you can do these kinds of papers. And they're actually quite in demand in the health management sorts of literature because everyone is trying to figure out how to do these things. And if you've been able to do it successfully and have overcome some of these barriers, people want to know how you did that. The primary clinical results, but then there might also be subgroup analyses or other pieces that are appropriate. So again, you want to help your mentees think about that. You also want to help them think about how many of these can they be really legitimately first author on? Does that make sense? Or should there be a writing team where different members of the team get to be first author on different aspects of the work? The other thing that I've found very helpful as a mentor is to point my mentees at the Equator Network website, which collects all of the journal guidelines for different types of studies. Most of us are familiar with Consort for clinical trials, with Prisma for quality improvement research, and so on. And so there are a whole list of these that appear on the Equator Network: the GRACE principles for observational CER studies, the Prisma for systematic reviews. For survey research, sadly, guidelines are probably still needed. The STARD statement for studies of diagnostic accuracy, the STROBE for epidemiology, the Moose guidelines on the Cochrane site for meta-analysis of observational studies, interviews and focus group studies, quality improvement studies, the Squire statement, and so on. And as I've kind of brought up a couple of times, I think that one of the big roles that a mentor plays is setting the culture and helping the mentee who's new to this world understand about authorship, theoretically and ethically, who should be an author, who's allowed to be an author, what do you need to do to be an author, what is and is not an authorship contribution, and then the practical concerns around intellectual contribution. What do you do with your assistants? And then this question that I brought up earlier about the role of senior colleagues and mentors, and when may you as a mentor need to step in and intervene with another senior colleague who comes from the older school, kind of prior to the IJCME ethical guidelines, and and was used to the just being on all the papers kind of world, and help them understand that, because that's a very hard thing for the junior investigators to do on their own. But in addition to deciding who should be the authors, there's this whole big thing about managing the co-authors and helping your mentee manage co-authors. One of the things that I recommend to my which I do myself and recommend to my less experienced writers, is when you send out an email asking for edits, send it out in a way that both allows people to inform you of their ability and their schedule, but also covers you if they don't ever get back to you so that you don't have to wait. And so I typically use some sort of wording like, Dear all, I've incorporated everyone's comments from the last round of reviews. Thank you so much. I think this is a near final version. Please get comments back to me in 2 weeks, whatever date you want to put on that, whatever's reasonable. Please get comments back to me in 2 weeks, and I'll incorporate them and submit, send this out to you for final review prior to submission in 2 weeks. If I don't hear from you within 2 weeks, I'll go ahead and submit, assuming that you consider this version an appropriate final version. If you have any scheduling issues or so on that would preclude you from responding in 2 weeks, but know that you do have comments that you want to make, please let me know when I can expect to receive those, and I'll revise my timeline accordingly. That, I think, sort of covers you for if they don't get back to you at all, you've basically told them that that means that they've basically accepted this as a final version, as incorporating their prior comments and so on. And if they do have, it's not as if you've said you have to do it in 2 weeks or I'm not going to listen to you. You've given them the opportunity to contribute and to let you know what the schedule should be for their contribution. And then, of course, all of us are busier as we become, more senior. We all become busier and busier, and you all know that is true. But it's important that we're not part of the problem. And so, it's important that we're realistic in our timelines when we tell our mentees when we're going to turn around their work for them, what we can and can't do for them, helping delegate some of that work if it's appropriate so that, we're not holding up things. The only other thing about authorship order is that there is field-specific differences in authorship. Obviously, many of us are familiar with the first author, last author, and then everyone else kind of approach in clinical medicine, but in other fields, that's less true. It's more first, second, third, fourth in order of contribution. And in others, it's everyone is assumed to have contributed equally and they're done alphabetically. So it's important that if you're working in these multidisciplinary areas and you're publishing in not your main area's journals, that you know what the standards are or the conventions are for those fields. I always remind my mentees of this. We often forget to remind them because we know that, that it's important that you not use the abstract that you used for the meeting abstract, but that you write a new abstract after you finish the paper, that you, make sure the references are properly formatted and that there's a good grammar, spelling, statistics check, that, that almost all journals now use plagiarism checking software, which includes self-plagiarism. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean you can use it again in another publication. And understanding the online submission systems and how they work. Those are often fairly baffling for newer authors. And then the same, the other place that I think the mentor is hugely helpful is the revise, resubmit, resurrect part of the program. And I'm surprised at how many junior investigators, especially residents and fellows, get what we would all consider a very nice revise and resubmit rejection and basically cry and stuff it in a drawer because they're sure they've been rejected and their work is not appreciated. And so it's important to let them know that you'd like to review that with them when it comes back, and that, to hold their hand as long as you need to, let them cry for 10 minutes or whatever, and then move on to getting the revisions done and the work published. There are times when it's appropriate to push back on a rejection, and sometimes it's more appropriate for a senior author to do that, especially as we may be more likely to know the editor personally or whatever. I tend to do this when a reviewer has made a factual mistake and are saying a paper has a fatal flaw, due to their misunderstanding of something. And then the other place that we help with is if it really is a rejection, as opposed to a revise and resubmit letter, where do they go next? Is it more appropriate to go down to the next less impactful journal in the same sort of string? Is it appropriate to go over? Do you move from hospital medicine to infectious disease, or from surgery to oncology if it's about surgical oncology or whatever? Do you move over, or do you move outside the box, and do you think about quality and safety journals or other types of journals that might not be as familiar to clinicians? And, you know, this idea when it's a tough one, but you think the work's important, to help your mentees keep plugging, sometimes bringing in new people with a new viewpoint will help, adding some kind of a hook, or thinking outside the box. You know, I've had things where authors wrote a really interesting paper about what the mammography messages were in low literacy versus higher literacy journals. They submitted them to several sort of surgical oncology or oncology journals and to some public health journals, and no one was interested. And so I actually just rewrote literally one paragraph of it. It was a really well done paper. Rewrote a couple paragraphs of the introduction and a couple of paragraphs of the discussion to sort of say physicians need to understand that their patients come to them with different expectations and so on of their healthcare based on what they're reading, and in order to conduct good shared decision making in areas like, this was about mammography, in areas like mammography and breast cancer, you know, we all agree that shared decision making is important in these areas, and so it's important that physicians kind of know. And then went into the message about there were different messages in lower education group journals than higher education group journals, and these were women's magazines. And it got published in the first journal we sent it back to. So, you know, so I think sometimes those kinds of things can make a difference, and it's probably easier for mentors to see that than for less senior authors. So that's all I had. Erin, you can probably stop recording then, and if anyone has questions or comments, we can have a discussion, or if not. And if you have offline comments for me about whether this was at all useful, or if there was things I missed or that you'd like to see included in these sorts of things in the future, please feel free to contact me directly. You can email me or whatever.